Thanks for taking the time to download this BBC Radio 5 Live podcast. To search for other podcasts you might like, click bbc.co.uk/5live, where you'll also find our terms of use.
Ever been fined for going too fast on a motorway? Today on 5 Live investigates why doubt is being cast on thousands of speeding convictions. We've seen evidence that the Crown Prosecution Service has questioned the legality of variable speed cameras on busy stretches of motorway. And questions were first raised about this 3 years ago. One former police officer turned traffic expert now reckons motorists found guilty should have their penalties overturned. As always, we want your reaction to what you're hearing. You can text us on 85058, email goldberg@bbc.co.uk, or on Twitter, we're at BBC5Live. Our reporter Emma Ford has been investigating. And Emma, these variable speed signs we're talking about, they're basically meant to keep traffic flowing on congested motorways.
Yeah, they come on automatically and are controlled by a computer which works out what speed vehicles should be travelling at based on the volume of traffic. The more congested the motorway is, the lower the speed limit. The limit then appears on an electronic sign on the overhead gantries you see.
And the way these signs look is laid down in law. If they aren't the right shape or size, they can be challenged.
That's right, and that's where this story gets really interesting, because late last year, at least one police force thought the signs didn't comply with the law. In November, both Warwickshire and West Midlands police forces suddenly stopped enforcement of the variable speed limit on the M42 in the West Midlands.
Now let's speak to Leon from Worcester, who found his case was being dropped just before Christmas. Leon, very good morning to you.
Good morning.
You were accused of speeding on the M42 last year, and you were going to fight the case, but then things changed just before you were due to go to court.
Yeah, literally, I'd been waiting for about 5 months for my court case, and then 2 weeks before I was due to go to court, we just heard through from the CPS that they were dropping the case, and they didn't give any reason for it either.
So no justification, no explanation?
No information whatsoever, just that they were dropping it, and that was that.
If you had lost your licence, what impact would that have had on you?
I would have lost my livelihood. I've just had my second child as well. So, yeah, it would have been a massive influence on my life.
Now, we've been able to establish that you were alleged to have been speeding on a stretch of the M42 where these variable speed signs were in operation and where it was decided that no prosecutions would continue. What do you think you would have felt like if you had been found guilty, only to find out it was on a stretch of motorway where enforcement had been suspended?
Well, I'd been outraged, obviously. It's not really fair, I don't think, to be honest. It doesn't seem to be a level playing field. These cameras and things don't seem to be regulated very well, and they're basing the law on unregulated devices.
Leon, thanks for joining us this morning. Emma, what was wrong then with the variable speed signs on the stretch of motorway where Leon was originally due to be convicted, or due to be prosecuted, I should say?
Well, all signs have to comply with something called the Traffic Signs Regulations and General Directions. Now, that sets out the design of traffic signs that can be legally used on our roads. Signs need to be the size, colour and type set out in those regulations. If they don't, they need separate authorisation. In the case of the font size on the signs was taller and thinner than is laid down in those regulations.
And these signs hadn't been properly authorised.
Well, that's a bit of a moot point, but the Crown Prosecution Service in the West Midlands didn't think so. I've got a copy of a memo they wrote in November. It says there is, and I quote, no authorisation from the Secretary of State for the speed signs on this stretch of motorway. And as a result, the police suspended enforcement on that stretch of the M42 between the 8th of November last year and January the 1st of this year.
OK, so you say it's a moot point as to whether these signs were legal or not, but in the view of the Crown Prosecution Service, they weren't legal. That sounds incredible. How long had these signs been there?
Well, one had been in place since 2006 and the other since 2009.
So when did the Highways Agency realise there were concerns?
We've established that the Highways Agency were first made aware of concerns about the legality of the signs in 2009. But after looking into it, they insisted the signs were lawful. OK, let's get a word with Neil Davis, who's a principal solicitor with the law firm Caddick Davis. Neil, good morning to you.
Good morning.
When did you first become aware of the issue?
We actually became aware of the issue in connection with a couple of clients we were representing in that local area. And there was certainly a disparity in relation to how these clients were dealt with. We had one client, for instance, who appeared at court in early November, before the CPS suspended these prosecutions. That individual received 6 points, and as a result of the points endorsed, he in fact was disqualified from driving. Strangely enough, then, we became aware a matter of days later where, in connection with an almost identical case, that person attended before the court and had his case suspended and subsequently dropped against him. So there is a massive disparity here in terms of how different people have been treated.
And we heard Leon in Worcester explaining that he hadn't been given any explanation as to why his case had been dropped. Were you given explanations as to why cases were dropped?
Unfortunately, this is something we see very regularly as motoring solicitors. It's not uncommon for Crown Prosecution Services to drop cases, and on the large part, they don't provide any explanation whatsoever. They didn't provide any explanation in this case, and it was only, in fact, when we actually chased the Crown Prosecution Service for an answer did we discover that there was an issue with regards to the signs authorisation.
And the suggestion is, given that these signs go back in some cases to 2006, that for 6 years drivers were being prosecuted for breaching a variable speed sign that should not have been enforced. What's your thought about that?
Well, I think for any right-minded person hearing that, it would simply appear unfair. And I think it's very important that when we are enforcing laws, that the Crown Prosecution Service, that the police do so fairly, because of course people are being punished as a result of this. And I think particularly in relation to these variable speed limits, what we find is that when people breach the speed limit, it tends to be by very significant margins, because if you're driving along the motorway at 70 miles an hour in accordance with what you believe to be the speed limit, and you pass through one of these variable speed limits and the speed's dropped to 40 miles an hour, then of course you've exceeded the speed limit by 30 miles an hour. And the courts sentence people based upon how far above the speed limit you are. So as a result of that, the penalties that tend to be imposed are very severe for these types of offences. People are tending to get at least 6 points endorsed on their licence, and if not, to be disqualified from driving.
Neil, we'll come back to you a little later. That's Neil Davies. Don't forget, we want your reaction to what you're hearing on 5 Live Investigates this morning. You can text us on 85058, email goldberg@bbc.co.uk, or on Twitter, we're at BBC 5 Live.
On DAB Digital Radio, digital TV, downloads and online.
This is BBC Radio 5 Live.
5 Live Investigates with Adrian Goldberg.
On 5 Live Investigates today, doubts cast on the legality of thousands of speeding convictions. We've established that on the M42 in Warwickshire and the West Midlands, the Crown Prosecution Service suspended enforcement in relation to variable speed signs for nearly 2 months last year because they feared they didn't meet the strict rules laid down in the regulations. Some lawyers believe that convictions based on these signs dating back to 2006 are unsafe. We'll also hear shortly about 7 other areas of the country that could also be affected. Been getting so many comments on this already. Our reporter Emma Ford alongside me. Emma.
Yeah, Susan from Derby's emailed in. She says this minor error does not alter the fact that the convicted motorist was speeding and therefore deserved points on their licence. Michael from Wokingham in Berkshire says, madness. Who cares what the font is? The signs were clear and unambiguous. And this is just a lawyer's ploy to get their clients off speeding charges. If you break the speed limit when it's clearly marked, then you should only have yourself to blame, not the road sign.
Yeah, on the text, Jeff in Cardiff says, your speeder is outraged at being threatened with prosecution. I'm outraged. He thinks he should get off breaking the law on a technicality. We will put some of these points to the lawyers in the studio, by the way, before the end of the programme. Fear not. And Deborah in Wakefield says, I have no sympathy for drivers not adhering to the speed limit. What does it matter whether variable speed signs comply to regulatory design? Drivers should stick within the prescribed speed.
And Mark from Loughborough says, what compensation is there going to be if people lost their jobs on the strength of these convictions, and how do insurance companies intend to compensate compensate people if the convicted people's premiums rose? And lastly, how do you unbesmirch someone's good name?
I'm not sure unbesmirch is a word I'd recognise in the Oxford English Dictionary, but I take your point, Mark in Loughborough. And Roy in London says, what happens to those, and I think echoing the point that Mark says, who as a result of such fines and points being overturned have been penalised by higher insurance premiums as a result? How will they be compensated? You can add your thoughts. You can email goldberg@bbc.co.uk, text us on 85058, or on Twitter, we're at BBC5Live. Now, Emma, we've been talking so far about the M42 around Warwickshire and the West Midlands, the area between Birmingham and Coventry. The Highways Agency, though, has now got authorisation for the controversial variable speed signs in that area.
Yeah, that's right. Following the decision by both Warwickshire and West Midlands Police to suspend enforcement on the M42 in November, the Highways Agency did, in November 2012, get official authorisation to use the signs in their current form. Now, that's on the M42 between junctions 7 and 9, which is patrolled by Warwickshire Police, and also between junctions 3A and 7, which falls under the West Midlands.
OK, so there's no doubt about it now. As of last November, regardless of the font size, regardless of the font shape, those signs are now legal on the M42, the variable speed signs. But it is an issue elsewhere as well, because there were 7 other locations where the same signs were, until November, arguably anyway, legally dubious. Where are they?
Right, well, they are the M40 junction 16 to the M42 junction 3A, which is where the two motorways merge west of Leamington Spa. The M6 between junctions 4 and 5 to the northeast of Birmingham. Now, still with the M6 between junctions 8 and 10A around Walsall. The M1 between junctions 25 and 28, that's near to Nottingham. Also on the M1 between junctions 6A and 10, Watford and Luton. And on the M20 in Kent between junctions 4 to 7 around Maidstone. And finally, the M25 between junctions 10 and 17. That's Cobham in Surrey and Rickmansworth in Hertfordshire.
Oh, we should have got Orna Merchant in to do that lot, shouldn't we? Now, in all those areas, just to clarify, the Highways Agency got new authorisation for those signs last November, even though the signs had actually been up for years.
Yes, that's right.
But if the Highways Agency has had to seek authorisation for the variable speed signs at 9 stretches of motorway, doesn't that imply that the previous signs were not lawful and that therefore all of the convictions obtained at those sites should now be overturned? Questions for Ginny Clark, the Director of Network Services for the Highways Agency.
They were legal. The point was, did they sufficiently show to people what they intended to show, the speed limit at that time?
But you'll be aware that there are quite specific regulations about the appearance of motorway signs, and these signs didn't meet those requirements, did they, until you retrospectively applied for authorisation on November the 27th.
Well, I think when they were originally put there, and those signs have been there for a little while on a number of schemes, everybody was content that they did satisfy them. This is a relatively minor detail about the shape of the number. And I think when we reviewed it, when it was first brought to our attention in 2009, we felt it was quite clear what these numbers were and how they were visible to the road user. And that was the key point of what these signs are trying to do. Subsequently, one of the police authorities in 2012 took a decision that at that stage they weren't happy to necessarily proceed with enforcement, and that's when we felt it was necessary to do this minor technical adjustment within the authorisation, so then there was no doubt whatsoever.
You can understand my confusion perhaps, though. You applied for authorisation for these signs in November 2012. If they were legally enforceable, why were you seeking authorisation then, given that some of these signs had been up since 2006?
The point was that people had started to say, is there a difference here? Now, we felt certain that it didn't make a difference, but because there was some uncertainty, we wanted to remove any of the difficulty around this relatively different shape of the number. And by having this additional authorisation, we were able to remove the issue.
Warwickshire Police were obviously not happy, were they?
Well, yes, I mean, they made it clear to us, and we then took the step to get the additional authorisation.
But if Warwickshire Police weren't happy, does that not imply that the signs were not to a sufficient standard to be legally enforceable?
No, they must take a view, rightly so, about what they enforce and what they don't. In this particular case, we recognise that the complexity of getting this agreement sorted out meant that it was easier if we actually put in a formal authorisation. But up until then, we used these signs for a considerable number of years, and everybody accepted that that's what they were. They were showing the speed limit, and that's how we're operating.
But if Warwickshire were not happy with them and did not believe they were sufficiently legally sound to be enforceable, does that not call into question thousands of convictions over the years for speeding?
I really can't comment on that. It is a matter for CPS and police and all the different police authorities to take a view on that.
That's the view of Ginny Clark from the Highways Agency. Let's speak to Richard Bentley, a former police officer turned traffic signs and traffic management consultant. Good morning to you, Richard.
Good morning, Adrian.
What do you make of what Ginny's had to say?
Well, I find it quite startling that the Highways Agency would try and present this as a minimising comment to what is a very serious issue. Let's be clear on this. The regulations say signs have to be as prescribed. OK, that's a standard basis that we must work with. Then they're called traffic signs. If they're not prescribed, then what are they? Well, the government give a wonderful definition which sort of contradicts what she says. And they say in their own publication, which is standard national guidance, the use on public highways of non-prescribed signs which have not been authorised by or on behalf of the Secretary of State is illegal. And authorities who use such signs act beyond their powers. Additionally, an unauthorised sign in the highway is an obstruction, and the consequences of erecting or permitting the erection of obstructions may be severe. Now, that's government policy, that's government intent. And in the authorising document issued by the Department for Transport, in what I would call a panic moment, it states clearly, and being a non-prescribed variant of the sign to diagram 670. So clearly, the Highways Agency are wrong.
Well, according to Ginny Clark, Richard, she said, look, the schemes had been authorised. You know, these variable speed schemes had been authorised in the round, and that to pick on the specific signs is to miss the point. That's why she would argue that they were always legal, because the traffic schemes of which these variable speed schemes were authorised, were legal.
Again, that's another slight deflection. It just moves the goalposts. Every local authority creates traffic orders. That's what imposes a restriction on a road. And the Highways Agency and the Secretary of State are no different. They create orders, but theirs are statutory instruments. The traffic management orders that local authorities create are done internally. In those orders, and there are many in cities, some of them are dormant because they don't have any traffic signs. And when I say dormant, it means they're not enforced because there's nothing there in law to indicate to the public what applies. And the only thing that can indicate the effect of what is called a traffic order is a traffic sign. And if you haven't got a traffic sign, the order is dormant. And
but in this case, it wasn't that there was no traffic sign, was it? There was a slight issue with the size and the shape of the font.
No. Again, missing the point. I can design a sign. I can design lots of signs. But unfortunately, the government will not let me use them, because they have to be to a precise format.
Do you believe these signs then, these variable speed signs, were illegal?
Absolutely. And that's what the government says. It's not me. They say they are of a non-prescribed variant, so they needed special authorisation.
And do you believe, therefore, as a result, that the thousands of motorists who may have had convictions as a result of these variable speed signs should now have those convictions quashed?
Oh, even better than that. Well, if you want to put it bluntly for your listeners, in the Act of Parliament that applies to this, if a limit of speed is to be observed on a road, a person shall not be convicted of driving a motor vehicle on the road at a speed exceeding the limit unless the limit is indicated by means of such traffic signs as mentioned above. So in other words, unless the traffic signs, the Act of Parliament prohibits anybody being convicted. That's not a defence. That's not a technical defence. It's a prohibition of conviction to ensure these people do the jobs right.
So you believe, just so we're clear, you believe then these convictions should be overturned?
Well, the law prohibits them being applied in the first place.
But given that the convictions have now taken place, what should happen?
Well, the magistrates can reopen the cases, and they have done so in places such as Salisbury, where in that area the Highways Agency got it wrong, and the court opened those cases, I believe, under Section 144 of the Magistrates' Court Act, and the convictions were quashed. As regards the other aspects of it, those people that have got points on the licence because they've paid fixed penalty tickets, in many cases, such as Chidiock, where the Secretary of State's Highways Agency got it wrong, he quietly paid 25,000 people back because of a minor error in the naming of a street in a traffic order.
Now listen, Richard, let me put a point to you that many, I have to stress, many of our listeners are making this morning. This comes from Russell in London. If a driver can't read a sign as it's in the wrong font, they shouldn't be driving at all. Many people completely unsympathetic with motorists who sped through these variable speed sign locations, saying that they were speeding. That really should be the end of it.
Unfortunately, no. And this is, again, I'm sorry for the chuckle, but no, it's missing the point. The speed limit on the motorway is 70 miles per hour. We all agree that, do we not?
Yeah.
Yes, that's the national speed limit, as defined and applied by the motorway regulations. If you want to alter that, you create a traffic order, and that's what the Highways Agency have done. In fact, they've created orders on several other motorways in which they say there aren't any signs. So those variable sites that are authorised by this document are not enforced because there is no traffic order. And in reverse, the traffic order can't be enforced if there are no signs. These are variable temporary speed limits, and in order for them to apply to anybody on the road, two things need to be in place: a valid order and a traffic sign, prescribed or specially authorised, that gives effect to it. If not, anybody could put up any sign they want and then fine people for not complying to it.
Richard? Go on, we'll leave it there with you for the moment. Thank you, it's fascinating. So I think we know where you're coming from on this one, it's fair to say. So look, Emma, Richard's been quite clear in his opinion that there is grounds for these convictions to be overturned, and he says there are precedents for it in places like Chidiock, for example. So have you been able to substantiate whether there are grounds for motorists to get their convictions reviewed?
Well, there's certainly inconsistencies in the way that justice was handled. So, for example, we know of two drivers, one who was caught allegedly speeding on the M42 on the 9th of April 2012 and the other on the 25th of April 2012. Now, despite there being just 16 days between these two alleged offences, one man had his case dropped, but the other was disqualified.
And this was the case you were referring to, wasn't it, earlier? Neil Davis, you know of cases where clients have been accused of almost identical crimes. One has not had the prosecution enforced, another has lost their driving licence.
Yes, there's been a number of cases like this, and I think if we go beyond any technical issues talking about legality of signage, I think what this raises fundamentally is an issue of fairness. People must be treated in the same manner. People must be punished in the same way for doing the same thing.
What should now happen then to those motorists who have had convictions at the sites of these variable speed signs before last November?
Well, unfortunately, it's a very complicated question because, of course, if people have fundamentally held their hands up, if they've accepted a fixed penalty notice, if they've pleaded guilty in court, courts will be very slow to reverse such convictions. Yes, there are options before the magistrates' court. Yes, there are options to take such matters to the higher courts. But it's far from being a straightforward answer. I think fundamentally,
if you've contested your conviction and been found guilty, would you have grounds then?
I think certainly the grounds would be far more arguable in those cases whereby a person has been convicted following trial and perhaps their defence has been, look, I wasn't aware that the speed limit was enforced, because of course that would appear to be consistent with this issue over the signage.
What would you say the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service, and the police should do now?
Well, I think in fairness, we have to say the Crown Prosecution Service in Warwickshire took a responsible stance here. They realised there was an issue. They didn't blindly continue forward prosecuting people. Instead, they chose to correct the issue here. But at the same time, that has, in effect, created a two-tier system. Some people prosecuted, some people not. So I think we do have to go back and look at those cases where people have been prosecuted.
Emma, what does the Crown Prosecution Service have to say?
Well, in a statement to us, the Crown Prosecution Service West Midlands say they notified West Midlands Police and Warwickshire Police of this issue in the context of ongoing cases in early November 2012, but did not offer advice on whether or not they should continue enforcing the speed limits. They say that's a matter for investigators.
But have they explained why they dropped some cases then?
Well, they said it wouldn't be in the public interest to proceed with cases which motorists are contesting at the same time as the police who are pursuing uncontested cases. They said it would be manifestly unfair for only defendants who contested an allegation to be prosecuted.
But this goes to the question of fairness that Neil raises. There will be other people who've received convictions, possibly even bans, who may even have lost their jobs as a result of being convicted of breaking the speed at these various variable speed sign locations.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, the difference between some people, obviously, the knock-on effects that we've been hearing from listeners about whether they've, the knock-on effect on their insurance premiums or their livelihoods if they lost their licences as well. OK, well, later in the programme, we'll explore further what chances motorists who've been caught out in these areas have in overturning their conviction. And we'll hear more of what you've got to say about this. You haven't been backward in coming forward today. You can email goldberg@bbc.co.uk, text us on 85058 or on Twitter. We're at BBC5Live. We'll also be hearing about the banned sports supplements available on eBay, Amazon and Gumtree.
On DAB Digital Radio, Digital TV, downloads and online.
This is BBC Radio 5 Live.
5 Live investigates.
On 5 Live Investigate shortly, the sports supplement banned after a runner died at the London Marathon. We've been able to buy products containing the active ingredient that contributed to her death. First, though, more of your reaction to our story about variable speed signs that the Crown Prosecution Service says were not legally authorised, casting doubt on thousands of convictions. The CPS and police in the West Midlands and Warwickshire withdrew cases affecting signs on parts of the M42, believing they wouldn't stand up in court, and we've identified 7 other areas where the signs were arguably not authorised either. According to the Highways Agency, the signs were legal, but we've heard from one former police officer turned traffic consultant who believes many cases going back to 2006 were illegal. Emma Ford's alongside me, sifting your reaction. No shortage of it, Emma.
There's not on the email. Tim from Bristol says, if the signs are incorrect and convictions based around them are annulled, what happens about the consequential losses incurred by individuals who lost licences and had increased insurance premiums?
Yeah, Pete in Widnes says, I'm really starting to despair at the lengths people will go to try and avoid their responsibilities. The numbers appear to be perfectly clear, so anyone caught speeding only has themselves to blame. Claiming the font of the numbers was wrong is just clutching at straws. And John in Windsor, though, says, and this is a point picked up as well by Andrew in Corby, he says the numbers are not very clear. A 50 and a 60 look too much alike when you're concentrating on driving around the traffic. So that's an argument, I guess, for being quite strict about the numbers, the size and the appearance of the numbers on these variable speed signs.
Yeah, it is. And also Kath from Warrington says, how ridiculous. So because the font is slightly different, these motorists couldn't possibly read the speed limit and therefore were compelled to exceed the limit. I've no doubt this will result in compensation claims from greedy lawbreakers who now feel they're owed something despite the fact that they broke the law in the first place.
And it's a fair point to say as well, a lot of people saying, look, regardless of the font size or the look of the speed signs, people knew whether they were breaking the law. Quite a few people as well, though, making the point that if, for example, you've got a number plate that doesn't exactly comply with the legal requirements, you may well be convicted. So the law doesn't always give the motorist the benefit of the doubt.
We had a couple of emails like that this morning saying, I got stopped by the police, my number plate was slightly wrong, the font was slightly different, and, I got fined for it or I got points for it. And, they're sort of saying, well, that's a minor technicality on a font. How is that any different to this? Yeah,
so the argument being then that if the Highways Agency doesn't meet its technical requirements, which is the allegation, then motorists shouldn't be convicted. It's got to be consistent both for the motorist and for the Highways Agency. Keep your comments coming. You can text us on 85058. You can email goldberg@bbc.co.uk or on Twitter. We're at BBC5 Live. Between now and the end of the programme, we will